Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the July webinar for Project Trust. Today, we will be talking through trauma-informed engagement in legal settings. Today's webinar comes to you from Project Trust. We are a collaboration between USCRI, the Sinar Institute, and Brandeis University. We provide training and technical assistance through the Office of Victims of Crime to support the stakeholders within the human trafficking field and providing trauma-informed training to stakeholders throughout the nation. Today, our goals of the webinar include providing an overview of trauma responses that legal professionals may encounter when providing services. We'll also share best practices to identify trauma-informed and person-centered engagement within the legal setting. And we'll explore the implementation of these best practices in real time. During today's workshop, we just want to remind folks that we want to maintain a safe space, meaning we want to allow all of our colleagues the opportunity to ask questions and then seek answers. Please feel free to use the chat feature to share your comments or ask questions. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for a Q&A session, so please drop any and all questions for that time in the Q&A feature in Zoom. Today's subject matter experts include experts from the Sinar Institute as well as CAS, the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. My name is Naja Martin, and I am the Thrive Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator at the Sinar Institute. I will let each subject matter expert introduce themselves. We'll start with Jessica Mora.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Mora. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in New Jersey and currently serve as the Chief Resiliency Clinician and Immigrants' Rights Specialist at the Sinar Institute, where I provide person-centered individual therapy and case advocacy services, including participating in legal team meetings with the clients that we serve at Sinar.
Thank you, Jessica. And then I'll turn it over to Christy Cho from CAST.
Hello, folks. My name is Christy. I am a social worker and currently the senior social worker for the TTA, which stands for Training and Technical Assistance team at CAST.
Thank you so much, Christy. And finally, I'll turn it over to Erica Gonzalez from CAST.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erica. I am also with CAST. I'm a Training and Technical Assistant Senior Attorney. And I'm excited to talk to you all and work with you all today.
Great. Thank you so much, panelists. We'll go ahead and move forward now. So before we jump into this content, I just wanted to provide everyone with a few quick reminders to practice self-care during this time. We'll be talking about trauma responses and how best we as practitioners can respond to those trauma responses. So feel free during this time to take a break or use any self-care sensory items, stay hydrated, and feel free to walk away from your computer as needed. This webinar will be recorded and it will be posted to the Project Trust website within 1 week of the webinar. Okay, I will be turning it over to Jessica Mora, who will be leading us through the first part of our webinar today on understanding and mitigating trauma responses in a legal setting.
Thank you so much, Naja. So to get us started, I wanted to just share that understanding trauma and trauma responses can assist in ensuring a healthy and supportive environment for individuals who have experienced various incidents of trauma. And at the same time, it helps us mitigate further traumatization for clients and also vicarious trauma for legal providers and providers in general, including therapists as myself. Naja, can you go to the next slide, please? So when we are talking about trauma responses, we're talking about automatic neurobiological mechanisms of self-preservation and safety. And I will probably highlight this one more time because it's so important to really understand that the trauma responses that you are seeing on the slide right now are really something that is outside of the person's sphere of control. and it's happening at a very specific level, which is at the neurobiological level of the person's system and mind. And trauma responses is how our mind protects us from our environment, right? And trauma responses refer to the complexity of symptoms. So I was looking at the slide a few days back, and I'm like, this looks so nice and neat, right? And trauma responses usually are not this straightforward in boxes, each in its separate category, right? Trauma responses manifest sometimes, most of the time, all together, all at once, in a matter of many times seconds. So even though the trauma incident might have ended, the symptoms of trauma can continue for an extensive period of time, especially if the person, the client, has not received proper support or might have experienced further traumatization. Some of the categories that you can think of for trauma-related responses is emotions, which can show up as depression, anxiety, numbing, and anger. Behaviors, and behaviors is sometimes a little more external, so we might be able to identify the behavior first. And this is how the person, the client, might act in front of us, right? And sometimes this can show up as reenactment, substance misuse, aggression, and isolation. And at the cognitive level, this is where we think, right? And it's about our thoughts and thought patterns. And here some examples of this can be self-blame, shame, dissociation, and flashback. I like to highlight here that self-blame and shame many times is connected, and I could say the same about dissociation and flashbacks. Dissociation might show up as a client saying, my mind went blank, right? Or, you know what, I can't remember that one moment, or I can't remember the specifics of that question you just asked. And flashbacks is about the individual re-experiencing a traumatic event as if it was happening in the present. And then under the category of the physical trauma-related responses, it's how the body is reacting to trauma, right? And even if the trauma has happened in the past, the body can still experience symptoms, right? That is related to the trauma. And this many times we refer as somatization, in which is there's physical symptoms that are not directly related to a medical condition. We also can hear many times clients talk about insomnia or the difficulties of sleeping, as well as digestive problems and headaches. Next slide, please. Some of the factors to consider in what impacts trauma responses is history and background of the individual, right? What was the client's upbringing, right? Did they have a support system while they were growing up? Possible any previous history of trauma, right? Has the client experienced other forms of violence? If so, clients might be experiencing symptoms of complex trauma and possibly post-traumatic stress disorder. Also details of the traumatic event, right? Was the person who caused harm or the perpetrator, was it a family member or was this a stranger or a partner of the client? This type of information and details will frame how the individual relates and understand their own trauma history. Also, we want to know or have a sense of if the person had resources available directly after the incident of trauma or violence. Because many times when the individual has access to resources after the trauma incident or event, it might mitigate some of the trauma responses, right? Also, we want to consider how does the client understand the traumatic event and the level of violence and or abuse they might have experienced in their lifetime. Next slide, please. So in guiding the process and guiding our process, your process as legal providers, we want to keep in mind, and this is something that I would like to encourage if this is something new, or maybe you already knew this, but it's not as present, to even write it down, keep it on a piece of paper, is that trauma responses are normal reactions to abnormal circumstances, okay? And how the client has learned to regulate their thoughts and emotions in response to trauma. I also like to highlight to clients directly is that even though we might say these are normal reactions, many times it does not feel normal to the client themselves, okay? So we want to be mindful of that word normal and how we're utilizing that. But for yourself, please remember that trauma responses are normal reactions to abnormal circumstances and also reactions to the trauma directly as well. There's also no right or wrong way to respond to trauma. As I mentioned before, these are responses that are happening at a neurobiological level, right? And this is the way of our mind and our body to keep us safe and try to cope with what we have experienced. And this will be different for each person you encounter. So I highly recommend to, if you have experienced a client and have witnessed a client to become extremely emotional to the point that they're crying and they have to walk out of the room, that shouldn't be your blueprint of how every client should react to the story they're telling you. Also, it's important to find out, if possible, what are some of the coping mechanisms of the client, right? Because that can be tools to use during any meetings that you might have with a client, and also encourage the client if there are any like healthy coping mechanisms that they have, that you can reinforce that for the client. And also consider and think about that coping mechanisms will change and will vary through time. Next slide, please. So in supporting emotional responses, we want to avoid minimizing or refuting a client's feelings, and we want to instead validate those feelings and emotions, right? So instead of saying to somebody, don't be sad, we might want to say it's understandable to feel nervous or that we feel sad. Sometimes when I get a little nervous before these meetings, we might want to even plug in, this is what I do when I feel nervous, right? And you can share maybe a tool that you might use in your practice. Also, we want to avoid all or nothing statements. Instead, normalize the responses to trauma. So instead of saying you have nothing to be ashamed of, you were a victim, we want to try and say it's really common for individuals who have been through what you have to have feelings that are similar to what you have shared. And I also wanted to highlight very quickly the word victim. It has many connotations to different people. So we want to refrain from that language as much as possible and let the client itself identify. Also, avoid extreme statements or language that can feel judgmental, such as, that is so shocking. Wow, I can't believe that happened to you. Instead, let's show compassion and thank the individual and the client for trusting you and sharing the information. Sometimes I've also witnessed attorneys really encourage the client and letting them know, you know what, I'm so glad you shared this with me because I can include this as part of your immigration relief application. Next slide, please. So supporting physical responses, we want to refrain from showing frustration at changes that may be related to trauma responses. That can lead to re-traumatization and make the trauma response increase. Instead, we want to ask clarifying questions in a non-judgmental way and explain why you're asking the question. And I think that asking the why with many of the tools we will be talking about today is super important because you're showing transparency and honesty with the person you're working with. Also, we want to avoid demanding language. And I am smiling right now because when I read this, I was like, nobody responds well to demands, right? So some of these are also very important in human interactions in general, right? So instead of using, talking really fast, so I need you to slow down, we might want to say, I'm noticing that when we talk about this, you start speaking very quickly. I want to make sure I'm understanding everything correctly. And again, here we might want to add, because I want to be able to put as much as I can into your immigration relief application or whatever legal document is being filled out at the time. Okay. Avoid criticizing clients for trauma response. Okay. Sometimes if we go back to like behavioral responses, we might witness clients tapping a lot or shaking their legs. Instead, go at the client's pace whenever possible. And you might want to say, we're going to go through some important parts of this. So first, why don't we take a break? Many times when people are shaking, tapping, and doing some form of physical movement, is because they're trying to self-soothe and they might need some movement. And we'll go a little bit later into some modeling and what else we can do in some of these instances. Next slide, please. Supporting behavioral responses. Avoid argumentative and defensive language when clients exhibit an anger response. We might say, you need to calm down. I don't know why you're yelling at me. I'm just trying to help. Instead, remain calm and try not to fight back or escalate an angry situation. And this will also, I'll revisit back when we go and discuss about modeling, right? And what I do want to say about this and not engaging in confrontation is that when somebody is experiencing a trauma response related to anger, most of the time, if you engage in that, in the confrontation itself, you will probably be dealing with the trauma response itself and not the client, right? Because now the anger is acting as a coping mechanism for that individual. Avoid threatening termination of services. This can be viewed as a breach of trust or abandonment. And I do want to highlight that this can also lead to power and control dynamics that are very similar to instances of trauma and violence, okay? So instead of saying we had a call schedule and you never answered, you need to be more responsible or we won't be able to continue working together. Instead, focus on setting boundaries in an empathetic way, which can be a great opportunity to model healthy behaviors for clients. So I am very transparent and honest with clients about my availability and what's my time like, my work schedule like, and what am I able to do and not do. Okay, so when we start sharing our capacity early on, clients know what to expect later in the relationship. Avoid accusing clients of drug use or risky behaviors. Instead, take a non-judgmental stance, right, about the risk of substance use. Sometimes how I've done this and have witnessed some attorneys do this is that the concern is shared from the perspective of like, we're concerned about what can happen if you're engaging in substance use, which sometimes can lead into law enforcement involvement, right? So for people who are pursuing some form of immigration relief, that can definitely become an issue in their process. Next slide, please. And finally, when we're talking about supporting cognitive responses, we want to avoid contradicting the client's feelings, right? And instead validate. I think we mentioned this before. Validation is such a great tool to have and to continue to use and mirror the language the client uses to increase their situation and relationship. So you can say, thank you for sharing the information about your boyfriend with me. It sounds like that relationship has been hard, okay? Avoid pushing unrealistic timelines whenever possible. We definitely understand that in the services that legal professionals provide, there's a lot of timelines and due dates that need to be met. But whenever possible, try to set some realistic goals and explain them, right? This is where we go back to the why. I need this information now or as soon as possible because I have to submit these documents in such and such date. Avoid stigmatizing mental health treatment or making it seem like punishment. So instead, be honest about the limitations of your expertise, right? And you can say, I want to make sure you're getting all of the support you need. I work with an agency that might be able to provide more help or support and talk about it in those terms, right? So yeah, I hope this was all helpful. I'm seeing the chat there's some comments there, so I'm looking forward to reading some of your comments. and I'll be back in a little bit.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was extremely helpful, providing all of those really concrete examples of verbiage we can use in real time. So now I'm going to pass it over to Christy and Erica to talk through how we can implement a trauma-informed approach to engagement in a legal setting.
Awesome. Hi guys, this is Christy. Jessica, that was amazing. We definitely want to see that handout one pager of those practical rewrites. So next slide, if we can go to. Awesome. Okay. So in trauma-informed practice, there are 4 key assumptions that we make about people at all levels within the organization. These 4 R's are realizing the widespread impact of trauma and the various ways that we can have healing and recovery. We recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in not only our clients, but families, staff, and others involved in the system. We respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and we actively seek to resist re-traumatization for clients as well as for staff. Next slide. So the goal of our section is to help pull down practical steps that legal service providers can take to be trauma-informed, given that these steps are not going to be clinical in nature. As attorneys, you are not necessarily equipped to provide clinical support and trauma responsiveness in legal settings. Like these 4 R's are going to look very different from your social service counterparts.
Okay, so the way that we've divided this is really looking at how we prepare to be trauma responsive in 2 contexts. One of those is looking at what we do before we meet the client. And half of that work, most of the work really is before you meet the client. And then we're going to talk about how you do these, this trauma-informed responsiveness during the client interactions. And when we talk about before we meet with the clients, we're going to talk about creating intentional practices in a legal setting. And that includes centering your practice through a framework of cultural humility. And then 2, locating where the power imbalances that exist in your relationship negatively affect your client. And looking in there, how we value our time comparatively to our clients and how our clients are already in a vulnerable position when seeking our services. Then when we talk about talking to our clients during or having that trauma responsiveness during the client interactions, we're going to look at how we reframe trauma responsive legal practice. And then we're going to talk about how we minimize that re-traumatization through the legal process. So I'll turn it over to Christy in the next slide. And you can actually move it forward 2 slides.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so creating intentional practices. The first practice is this quote. It's pretty encapsulatory in my opinion. This first practice is a reframing of what it means to be therapeutic. And I want to apply this reframing to how we see the first 2 R's, realize the widespread impact of trauma, and then recognizing the signs and symptoms. If we think about the way we work with clients as a 3-point spectrum, where we have therapeutic, neutral, and harmful, we are asking at the very least to not cause harm. And we say this way because we're not asking or expecting attorneys to go and somehow get a clinical degree. And it's okay if you're not ready to incorporate some of the more therapeutic techniques that this webinar discusses and has discussed. But at the same time, we should not be going in blind. That's a really great way to cause unintentional harm. So then a good first step is to cultivate the ability to talk about trauma in a comfortable and normalized way. And I do want to point out that Jessica's lists of things to avoid and how to reframe some of the default responses that may come out when we are faced with trauma and trauma symptoms in our clients, that's a really great way to practice kind of switching up our language. And this also might require you to read up on trauma, to kind of graze a couple articles here and there, and again, to practice new wording and language and so on.
So I'll talk about this concept of good lawyering. I think when Christy and I really were talking about putting together this slide, one of the things that we talked about is how a lot of good lawyering practices are already trauma informed, and they tend to be sometimes separate or lumped together depending on who you're talking to. But I want to help us start to reframe the idea of good lawyering and being intentional of recognizing what part of good lawyering is actually a trauma responsive practice. For example, when we're recognizing in respondents to the client's feelings of anxiety and how we interact with that, that's good lawyering, but also trauma responsive. Clarifying legal processes for the client that they're dealing with and interacting with, including clarifying anything that they're struggling to understand and being flexible in those conversations. And then just generally advocating for the appropriate rights and protections of our clients. These are all examples of good lawyering, but are also great examples of being trauma informed. And I want us to think about the fact that as lawyers, it is our ethical duty to follow the, what the client wants, right? So if we're doing that and we're following the client goals, that means we're advocating for what the clients wants and not what we think is best for the client. Again, that is a trauma-informed approach to doing these things. I think what's missing, though, is the intentionality that we have in connecting the practices that we're doing with trauma responsiveness. Christy, go ahead.
And the last point is on practicing cultural humility. This falls under the third R of trauma-informed practice, which is being responsive to trauma, but not in the way that we think. We're going to be reframing a little bit of what trauma responsiveness can look like in a legal setting in a couple more slides. We're also aware that practicing in cultural humility, it's heavily tied to core principles of being trauma informed. Specifically, the 2 bullet points that we have here: collaboration and mutuality, transparency and trustworthiness. And when it comes down to the takeaway points around cultural humility, because this is not the webinar to dive deep into this, both of these points really are carried over into creating authentic and genuine working relationships with our clients. And as the initiator of this whole process, you're the one who sets the tone by using an attitude of humility. You're reflecting on any assumptions you're bringing into interactions with your client. Since your client is the expert, we're assuming the listen as if the speaker is wise stance. And we work on minimizing the power imbalances. Next slide.
And I think that's a great definition or a great transition into talking about power dynamics. And I do think that Jessica did a really good job about introing this for us, but just to kind of loop it back together, I wanted for us to have a shared definition of power dynamics. And really, power dynamics are relative levels of power, both real and perceived, between 2 or more people that impact interactions with each other. And when we're looking at that within the attorney-client relationship, we have to understand that a lot of those power dynamics exist, right? And we're looking at them in this context for the purpose of creating working partnerships with our clients to build on collaboration and that mutuality that Christy talked about in the last slide. So I do want to highlight the 3 very common and recognizable power dynamics that exist in the attorney-client relationship. The first is the fact that as attorneys, we are knowledge and information holders, and this creates a natural power dynamic. And if you think about it, anytime you ask for help for something you don't know how to do, how disarming that can feel. I know I'm someone who doesn't like to ask for help. So for me, anytime I do that, it feels like a lot. But really think about that from the context of the client. They need something from you. And that creates a natural vulnerability that is often overlooked in the attorney-client relationship. Attorneys also have a natural cultural pedestal as a direct result of our career choice. And I'm sure all of you know that different societies view attorneys in a certain way, despite all the lawyer jokes that they're all out there. But you can imagine that when you already have this vulnerability of having to ask for help, how that relationship is impacted when you're on a cultural pedestal already. And then the third power dynamic that naturally exists is that essentially the client is coming to you exposed, because they're sharing that trauma and exposing that with you. This includes telling a stranger intimate and traumatic personal stories that include a lot of things, including sexual assault sometimes. But also when they're coming to us so vulnerable with that trauma, they're coming to us when we have our biases and our egos. I think there's a lot of times that attorneys have a certain perception of what victims look like or how they will act. I hear a common thread that when clients aren't necessarily acting positively, that there is an assumption they're ungrateful for our services, as opposed to looking at what Jessica shared with us earlier of what trauma responses look like and how they might manifest. And I think there is also this additional vulnerability that happens when we as attorneys have the idea of what we believe a successful outcome will look like or what a positive outcome is in comparison to our clients. I just want to remind folks that trafficking exists because of power dynamics and vulnerabilities as one of, like, that's one way it's able to be successful. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why trafficking exists, but its success is essentially built on these power dynamic structures. And I always go back to this quote by Amy Fleischauer from the International Institute of Buffalo, who says, "How can we act as differently from the trafficker as possible?" And what that means for me is, how do we start to shift the power dynamics to be more equal so that we're not overpowering our clients and influencing them a lot on their decision making. Next slide. So what we are going to go over is a very common example of a situation with attorneys. So I pulled this example from a lot of different experiences that I've heard of case managers and clients talking about working with attorneys. And so after that, we're going to ask a question and then you can put your answers in the chat box. So I will read this out loud, and I promise to read it out loud slowly for the interpreters. Frida has a referral from a social work provider for a potential trafficking survivor. Frida sets the appointment with the survivor at 2 p.m. in the afternoon with the social service provider. On the day of the appointment, the potential client, Molly, is 40 minutes late. Frida is annoyed that Molly is late and comments that next time Molly should call if she's going to be late so they can reschedule. Molly was very apologetic and explained that her friend couldn't give her a ride, so she had to take the bus. Molly did not explain to Frida that it took 3 buses for her to get from her job to the attorney's office. During the consultation, Molly explains to Frida that she has a long criminal history. When Frida tells Molly that she should work with law enforcement, Molly immediately shuts down. Molly refuses to work with law enforcement and tells Frida that she wants to have a clean slate and move forward. Frida insists that Molly has a good case and that she should get justice for what happened to her. Molly was visibly uneasy about the idea of cooperating with law enforcement. Despite Molly's trepidation, Frida insists that she has trustworthy law enforcement who will help Molly in her case, and Molly reluctantly agrees to report. So the question that I have for all of you is, what do you see as the most significant power dynamic here?
And please feel free to type in the chat. We are reading it and we will respond.
I'm going to give a couple seconds. Christy, maybe, do you want to give a hint?
What? I am the expert here. I know best. Okay. I'm going to butcher your name. Josette said that's actually a really good one. They're pointing out Frida's attitude. And so that's definitely one on our list, that Frida is expressing their entitlement to be treated a certain way by their client. The annoyed attitude emphasizes that cultural pedestal ego that Erica mentioned before. Let's see what else. Yep, attorney's ego. Let's see, Frida's note taking into consideration trauma with the police. That the relationship with law enforcement and the assumption of friendliness is something that Frida is bringing in and is pushing onto her client, Molly. This is going to influence the way that Frida will advise Molly, and it's going to impact the way that Molly is going to trust or not trust Frida's advice.
Can I ask the question again too? So you all identified one of the most important ones. Are there any other issues with power dynamics you all see?
And to be fair, we're looking for one last point. We're looking for someone who's going to mention something very specific. And it's okay if you guys don't do it. We'll give you the answer at the end. But yes, all right.
Michelle got it.
Michelle is winner. The lack of access to transportation. So we noted transportation as a significant power dynamic because we're identifying a lot of socioeconomic differences that are coming into play. And Frida is not taking into consideration all the effort that Molly has to make to get to Frida. This signals that Frida is not aware or concerned with Molly's struggle, and there's no accountability to have any kind of understanding around the client's situation and their issues. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So
and
you
I
guys,
just want to highlight a couple of the points also in the chat box. Like that is also included with the setting up of the appointment issue, right? Just reinforcing again, not being aware, concerned of Molly's struggle. In fact, not even interacting with them, you know, in the first place. And then definitely Alma wrote that showing lack of compassion for being late. And I think again, that goes back to Frida's attitude, right, that we were talking about.
And then Kendall also mentioned coercion, which we had just talked about, not mimicking the power, you know, imbalances that a trafficker might exhibit, and, you know, applying and pushing your, you know, mindset and your framework, your worldview, and not considering that your client is coming to you with different cultural identities. That's also like pushing your way of thinking forward. Absolutely, absolutely. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Thank you. So we can generally agree that shifting power imbalances is a good move, especially when working with clients who've experienced trauma. But what does this even look like in practice? Where do power dynamics come to play within our practice? So one very, you know, big thing that if you know me at all, and Erica has received this plenty of times, I'm a big stickler on shifting and reframing language in the way that we communicate. So this is going to be how we talk about clients and how we talk to clients. Our internal language on how we talk about clients, we should be very mindful of, for example, language that creates this quote unquote othering mentality, and it should mirror how we talk to clients. And I know that Jessica had mentioned previously the language and the heaviness of the phrase victim, that it means different things to different people. And I know that within the legal profession, victim is a legal status. Like it's like I'm going to butcher this, but it's like attached to certain rights and certain benefits and certain relief avenues. But that language becomes really familiar, and we toss it around because it's just language from our work. But when we're talking to clients, and if that bleeds through, if we're talking to partners who are not as, you know, legal, like mired in the legal process as we are, then that could be a little off-putting. And it is going to make a difference in how we are able to mirror how we talk to clients when we talk about our clients. And then also prioritizing language access for folks who need it. The next point is biases. So we think about biases in two different ways, implicit and explicit. Implicit stuff is, implicit bias happens automatically. Our brains are working to chunk patterns and trends together. And when we see a familiar pattern, our brain says, hey, we recognize this. This is split-second unconscious judgment. The work and the practical tip around implicit bias is to not try and stop the implicit bias, which research says does not work. But when we pivot to practicing clocking those implicit bias thoughts and realizing that they are not how you really think about the client, the situation, the context, that's the real work there. The next one is The explicit bias is what Erica had mentioned before, these cultural pedestals, the way that society has designated power to certain professions and identities. Consciously, intentionally stepping off that pedestal is a big way of shifting these power dynamics. And that conscious, intentional step is really important. And this might be something that you do every meeting that you have, like being able to explain your role is a good example of you're putting yourself in this. Like I do hold knowledge, but I am freely sharing this information with you. You have a right to this information. You don't have to supplicate your way into my knowledge base. I am making this as easy as possible for you to access this information, identifying what you think the goal of your partnership is with your client, and then asking the client if that's accurate. You're passing that power ball. I'm going to mix these analogies together. You're passing the power to them, the ball is in their court. And then you emphasize that your partner is in this legal process.
And so then we'll move on to looking at shifting power dynamics from an organizational and firm culture. And I have to say that Jessica's comment on the threatening services is something that we see a lot with attorneys as part of, this. I hesitate to use coercion, but almost like coercion to do what we want them to do, our clients. But really, I think also when we're looking at organizational and firm culture, we're looking at things that we do to make the work easier for us, but don't consider our clients. And that includes, as Christy was saying, the ease of access of services and our consistent use of legalese, which one of the things that we talk about with power dynamics in language is when we're using essentially a different language to try to communicate to our clients how to navigate through certain systems. So I think in this point, it's important to identify whether some of the practices that we have in our organizations and our firms were created arbitrarily, like this idea of starting work from 9 to 5 is, a societal concept, but does it actually work for the clients that we're trying to serve? Or are we creating processes that are easy for us and help us move smoothly within the organization without considering the cost that they have to the client? So how are our late policies inflexible to clients like Molly, who might have to take several buses to get to our office? And yes, I do still have a landline in my house, so I apologize for that ringing. The next power dynamic that we're looking at too is systemic oppression. And what we're talking about here is looking at racial and legal oppression and how to navigate systems when accessing resources or information that tend to be bottlenecked at a certain point for certain people who have power. So what this means for us is how do we become aware of what advocacy is necessary for our clients within systemic oppression? And this requires awareness of what our clients' goals are. And I think that one thing that happens that can reshift the power dynamics where the power is heavy on the attorneys is when we think of ourselves within our attorney-client relationship of trying to right the wrongs in the legal system and not thinking about ourselves as tools for what the client wants in that moment. There are avenues to do this larger writing of the legal system where we're not using our specific client as a conduit to what we believe is an injustice. So I want us to be able to differentiate what is macro advocacy versus what is micro advocacy. The other thing is that clients should really feel confident to use us as tools or pull the attorney card to help them navigate these oppressive systems. And that's not necessarily, saying, oh, my attorney is going to handle that, or wait till you call my attorney. But more of the client being able to know when they can use you and when it's not just using you for advocacy, but to bounce off questions or concerns that they might have. And then again, and all of you already identified this, understanding that your professional experience interacting with oppressive systems doesn't necessarily translate to your client, or your client doesn't necessarily get the benefit of your relationship with these oppressive systems. And your reality isn't your client's reality with the systems. I see a question in the chat box about what about lateness is accepted or an asked to be notified? Is this unfair? Christy, are you understanding this question?
I think so.
Okay, do you want to try?
Do I want to try? So we know that lateness is something that we deal with whenever we're working with human beings. But it's this conception of, well, the way that Erica has talked about the late policy is that in relation to arbitrariness and the convenience of an organization being prioritized over a client and the considerations that should be afforded. So that's the way that I'm interpreting that particular question, that, it is absolutely fair to be asked, hey, please let me know. You can text me or you can give me a call, shoot me an email if you feel like you're going to be late. Those are always great tips and points to ask a client or a potential client to do for you. But how penalized is lateness? Is it mainly because, the mentality is I got to be productive as an attorney? Like my time is really short. I'm, stretching every dollar that I can. And so that translates into that cost being off-putted onto the client. So if they cannot make this hour appointment on the dot, the 10 minutes, 15, then, it's a lot of this ill will that's kind of built up. You get frustrated because you're not meeting your time or whatever construct of like productivity that you're placing on yourself. And is this unfair? I don't think it's unfair to present a boundary, but how rigid are you holding that boundary, and where is the accommodation for clients who do take who are reliant on public transportation, which might be flaky in your city. We don't know, right? And then also traffic.
I was sorry. I was going to say, for me, the difference is when it's unfair and fair is when we're using these policies to be consequential or like punishment or penalizing. And then the way, Christy was talking, we talk about that situation within our office culture and that communication, how it builds a resentment towards clients who might be struggling with these basic things.
Yeah.
I think we can move forward to the next slide, and you can move it forward 2 slides.
Okay, so this is during client interactions. So now we're going to reframe what managing trauma symptoms can look like in legal settings, because that's really the implicit ask for all the trauma-informed trainings that are available in the field. They're very much geared towards clinical care, but then let's talk about it in a legal setting. So what it is not in the moment therapy. I'm going to ask that we fight against the instinct to quote unquote help or to make someone feel better. And I keep referring back to Jessica's amazing points. But just because trauma is manifesting in the moment in your office, in your interview, it doesn't mean that you have to fix it. Therapy is not in your wheelhouse as an attorney. It is not on you to become a clinician in that moment. And so we really want to hold that barrier for attorneys, that it's not something that you just need to feel comfortable doing. It's not a knowledge deficit issue. This is not your practice. So we don't want that therapy component to be burdening on to attorneys. What it is, what you do around experiencing trauma in your office, in your interview. Let the client express their trauma, again, without trying to fix it. Let's normalize trauma and uphold dignity. And what this might look like is you fight against the urge to crack a joke. This might sound funny, but we crack jokes to try and crack tension. And we don't want to diminish our clients' experiences or expressions of trauma because you're uncomfortable with what's happening. So we acknowledge that it exists for a reason, and Jessica had really great language and wording around it. So I would definitely have you guys go back and look at that wording. But this is also where your ability to talk about trauma in a comfortable way, again, being familiar with trauma, this is where it might come into play. If it goes on for a while, checking in, doing a temperature check, offering options. Do you want to bio break? Could I get you some water, a snack? Give those options. Offer to reschedule or reevaluate, particularly the goals of the meeting, or recenter the goal back to the relationship and why you're meeting. These are all great tips on shifting the way that we think about trauma-informed practice in a legal setting. Next slide.
So, despite all these tips that Jessica, Christy, and I are giving, we need to recognize that no matter what, the legal process is re-traumatizing. And we have to acknowledge why that is. There are complex systems that are really difficult to navigate, hard to understand. Clients have to relive their stories multiple times. There's not that many ways to minimize that storytelling, especially if they're involved in the criminal legal process. And because we have other due process rights afforded to defendants. And also there are circumstances which our clients are going to have to continue engaging with their perpetrator for extended period of time, depending on what legal processes they're engaged with. So at the time, there is no way to make re-traumatization zero in the legal process. So next slide. As such, we have to figure out how we minimize that re-traumatization. And I think that attorneys can actively work to minimize that trauma with things that are within their control. I did say that re-traumatization happens within the legal system, but can also be exacerbated by our organizational and firm cultures that bleeds into how we interact with the client. So what is one easy way to start minimizing re-traumatization? And I think that's limiting questions. I think one thing that becomes very apparent when attorneys are working with crime victims is this desire to open the spout and just let clients talk. But really, if you're thinking about how do I minimize re-traumatization, you're tailoring your intakes and assessments to questions that are necessary for you to know and not trying to overcast your net and get everything that's possible, right? And trafficking cases in particular, clients have the tendency to overindulge. And I think that a really trauma responsive attorney redirects where that information goes. So it's not, word vomit that we have to then try to sort out, and not only sort out legally, but also helping our clients to not have to, put all of that baggage back into their suitcase, which is not an easy process to do, especially when we don't have the tools to help them put their stuff back in their suitcase. Is that a terrible metaphor, Christy? You can just tell me later.
No, it's because we talk about when therapy unpacks and then you're supposed to pack it back. You can't just leave all their stuff strewn around because you've filtered through it, touched all these different things. A big part of being therapeutic in a clinical setting is to help the client put their stuff back together.
Well, you leave. You messed up the sports metaphor, so I messed up this metaphor.
I did. That's fair. That's fair.
So the second way is just understanding how legal practice impacts other areas of their life. I think one thing I see a lot with attorneys is the narrow focus on the case at hand, that they don't see how their case can have ripple effects in their life. We don't work in bubbles. So for example, if you're working in immigration context, have you thought about how this form of relief is going to impact the client in a custody case or a family law case in the future, if you know that part of the abuse stems from that relationship? Are you thinking about how they have to go home at the end of the day after giving us a full 2 to 3 hour conversation about their entire victimization, how is it that we think about our practice as a ripple effect in someone else's life? And then the third point I have is, you can minimize re-traumatization by being a strategic lawyer. Something happens again when working with crime victims, that attorneys just go into like a very sympathetic mode and almost take off their lawyer hat. And I want to say that just because systems ask for certain kinds of evidence doesn't mean we have to give it, right? Our role is to fight on behalf of our clients. So don't put your clients through unnecessary processes for the sake of just winning a case. This puts the cost of trauma on the client rather than on you to try to think of strategies on how to win with that evidence. And one common example is a lot of attorneys will default to getting their clients involved in psychological evaluations. You want to minimize client story retelling. Why are you getting them involved in another psych evaluation? When working with traumatized populations, it's not just about winning the short-term case, but also understanding the impact on how your legal work has on the client in the long run. Oh, that's all my slides and Christy's slides. We'll turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Erica and Christy. That was extremely helpful to put into context all of this really great information. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica Mora, who's going to close us out with a couple of tools and skills that legal professionals can utilize in their interactions with clients.
Thank you, Naja, and thank you, Christy and Erica. This was so great to listen to. I literally have written Post-its all over my laptop at this time with things that I'm taking with me, I should say, on the tips that you have shared today. So in continuing the conversation about tools and skills, I think both Christy and Erica touch upon this, about this like self-reflection piece when you were talking about like lateness and where did this late policy comes from and cancellation policy comes from, right? For tools and skills, I like to highlight that it really begins with our own intentions, thoughts, patterns, and our own self-awareness of where our intentions are, right? And what is our self-talk like? So I hope with the next few slides, we can really provide even further tools and skills. Naja, can you go to the next slide, please? So the first one is mirroring. It's a communication skill where we reflect back what the client's verbal and nonverbal forms of communication. And this helps to increase the connection, right? The building rapport with the client. This way, it also helps the client to feel heard and understood, right? So I know we have spoken a little bit about language, right? Such as using the word victim, right? Again, explaining why we're using that word and providing the context of it, that in submitting certain legal documents, this is what the courts understand, right? And the courts use the word victim and perpetrator, right? But when interacting with the client, making sure that you're using how they self-identify. Also, if they identify the perpetrator of violence as their partner, right? We might want to continue to use that language because it shows that we're listening, right? Another example here about nonverbal communication, sometimes clients have difficulties with eye contact, right? So if you notice that and the client continues to look away, let's not stare, right? And force eye contact, right? Let's check in. I think that's very appropriate to still check in with our eye contact, eye gaze, but also look away, right? And give that space. These are very unconscious type of interactions that we can bring into our consciousness and be mindful of, which it goes back to what I was saying before about our own intentions and being self-aware, right? Also our tone of voice in personal space, right? So instead of, if you're in a big room and meeting with a client, right? Instead of sitting across, far away from the client, maybe come and bring your chair a little bit closer, right? And just be mindful of that, and thinking about how you relate to people can be very helpful in that sense, in creating these habits also with clients, and how you meet with them. Next slide, please. So another one that is extremely important, and sometimes it's hard to like put it together in words, right, is compassionate listening. It really begins with the intention to be present with that person that you're working with. It involves taking the focus off of ourselves and really placing it on the individual. It requires non-adversarial questioning or non-judgmental listening. Compassionate listening provides a safe space or a comfortable space for the individual to feel comfortable expressing themselves and potentially opening up to you as their attorney. Here's where we go back to the validation of feeling, of the feelings and the experience of that individual, and not trying to fix it, right? I think something wanting to highlight here too is that clients are extremely resilient. They know how to cope, and have overcome so much that they will find ways to move forward, right? With whether they're meeting or resources they might need. So it's not something that you, like Christy and Erica highlighted, that you have to fix right away in that moment. So again, open-ended questions, being curious with, of course, very intentional curiosity, right? With how Christy and Erica mentioned about guided question or direct questioning that is specific to what the information you need for the legal case. And authentic acceptance, right? Where we intentionally accept the person and or the client as who they are, right? And it does not mean that you have to agree with everything that this person does, right? But it's important to keep that in mind and keep telling ourselves that this person has an extensive, possibly extensive history of trauma, and this is the way they cope. And that, going back to what we talked about, trauma responses, right? This is an automatic response that they're experiencing, possibly, right? Sometimes it's not always about trauma responses either. Sometimes people are having a bad day, and it's because they're having a bad day and not a trauma response as well. Next slide, please. Modeling. This is a great technique, something that I try to implement as much as I can, with, not just with clients, but even with coworkers and work environment. And this is where we model, we show, we teach, right? Clients are learning from us too, right? I have worked with clients where they have seen me interact with other service providers, and they start using some of my language, right? When they're interacting with other service providers in other meetings and other areas of their lives, right? So here we're attempting to modify through observation and imitation of another person's experience. So the modeling is like we're showing on our end, we're teaching, and the client is picking that up, right? And learning that. So in a legal meeting with the client, if you notice that the client is like sitting on the edge of their chair, right? Or maybe yourself, right? I do that a lot. I'm sitting at the edge of my chair. I usually will say, you know what? I am feeling kind of achy and tense. I'm going to get up. I'm going to fix myself. Feel free to do the same thing. And I'll intentionally actually lean back a little bit on the chair. So my whole back and my body is supported, right? And that way the client is watching you do that. And they might be also asking themselves, wait a minute, maybe I am feeling a little tense. Maybe I do need to like move around a little bit and stretch. So again, we want to show positive, healthy, and nonviolent behaviors in communication. So again, it goes through observation, retention, reproduction, right? And the motivation to do so. Next slide, please. So emotional regulation, this is where we become both the attorney, service provider, the client, the managerial position of our emotions. That's how I like to think about it. So it gives us a chance to take control or manage. Sometimes I don't use the word control too much, but at least manage and notice emotional responses, right? So if we think about trauma responses, right? And if the individual, the client is experiencing a trauma response at an emotional level, this can be extremely overwhelming. Physically, cognitive, and behaviorally can be very overwhelming. So with emotional regulation, with this tool, it helps us in regulating our emotion. It also helps us cope with difficult emotions. It increases resilient responses to traumatic events. It increases sense of safety in our mind and our thoughts, and reduces trauma responses. So again, when we're able to identify emotions, it gives us the chance to intervene prior to the emotion increasing or getting out of hand or feeling out of control or like it's too much to deal with. So sometimes asking the client, how are you feeling in this moment? Is there anything emotionally that might be coming up for you? And the reason you're doing that is not that you have to, again, fix it, right? It's just to give the space and room for the client to identify it and just take that moment to notice what is happening for them. And I'll be going over a case example a little bit, and I can share a little bit more why that might be important. Next slide, please. Relaxation skills are tools that helps us manage stress and trauma responses. They reduce the impact of prolonged stress on both the mind and body. They are also part of building self-care and witness practices that increases relaxation responses. It allows to release tension, right? If I'm able, even for a few minutes, right? And maybe this can be part of your closing after a legal team meeting where you and the client might engage in conversation about what are you planning, what is something relaxing you're planning to do this week or this month, right? Sometimes people don't have access right away to do a relaxation skill or activity. So maybe like think about long-term, short-term type of activities and skills. And this way, when you ask this, you might be able to pinpoint some coping skills that the client is already using that you might not know. It also it helps with reducing trauma responses, reduce stress on the body and mind, builds wellness and self-care practices, and promotes relaxation. Next slide, please. So self-soothing, it relates back to our ability to comfort ourselves. And this is something that we were doing as babies. If you think about rocking, right? When babies might move around the crib, that's a form of self-soothing. And as adults, we need to find new ways to do that. When traumatic experiences can bring up more frequent fight, flight, or freeze responses, which relates back to what we reviewed early on, that results in the individual carrying around prolonged stress that has negative impacts on their overall health. So having awareness of these tools helps us to prepare when challenges arise when interacting with clients. And self-soothing can also include picking up a glass of water, having some essential oils, having something that's tactile, and we'll go over some examples of this too on how to prep your office with some of these sensory tools, self-soothing and relaxing, and some of the emotional regulation tools as well. How it helps is reduces trauma responses, increases a sense of safety, again, in our bodies, our mind, and the environment. It increases resilient responses, supports well-being and self-care. It also helps, and this applies to also the relaxation skills, that it brings us back to our present and where we are. Many times for the individuals who are sharing their stories of trauma, As I mentioned earlier, I experienced dissociation. So having some relaxation and self-soothing tools accessible during a meeting or prior or after the meeting, it can be very helpful in having the client remember where they are, who are they meeting, and kind of find that space in between where they, in their present moment compared to the traumatic event. Next slide, please. So work with appropriate cross-sector collaborators to meet clients' need. I just think about the picture that comes to mind with this is a support system for you as the legal provider, right? Ensuring that collaborators in the client's team are trauma-informed whenever possible. Okay, I know sometimes it can be difficult to find trauma-informed providers, but if you can, make that effort to include people and collaborators that might be. Create or access systems and plans to create a multi-service approach to clients' needs. Also, including diverse stakeholders. Different providers and diverse stakeholders will create a comprehensive approach to addressing the client's needs. Also, clarify roles and fulfill those roles depending on clients and what the client needs, and also the stakeholders' expertise. Recently, during COVID, we had a few clients that were in need of access to food, right? And we were able to connect with some community resources that was their expertise. They were managing food banks and food delivery early on in COVID. So we were able to connect with them because for me as a therapist, that's not something that I really have the knowledge or access to do for clients. So share efforts and resources. It does not have to fall on you. Clients need your legal expertise. So whenever you have the ability to create and find resources, utilize the resources and share it with the clients. Next slide, please. So building a trauma conscious environment. Memory and traumatic memory are stored through our 5 senses, that is sight, smell, touch, hearing, and taste. So every time a client enters our offices, this includes Zoom, their mind and body is assessing the environment, and if the mind identifies any similarity, right, to their trauma or trauma history, it might lead to some trauma responses that we had discussed earlier. So we want to encourage you all to think about what are some things that you can have in your office or even in Zoom, right? I know Zoom can create a little bit of a barrier with this, but feel free to share in the chat if there's anything that you might have already in your office, something that you have used, something you might like to use. I'm going to give some examples of this too, but I'm sure there's some great feedback that you all might have on regards to having a trauma conscious environment, a pleasing, comfortable environment where you engage with clients. So in a virtual environment, we want to encourage clients to create their own sensory kit. And if they can, to bring it to the meeting, have it there with them whenever possible, or encourage them at the end of the meeting to utilize the kit as well. These are all, whenever we're doing these reminders with clients, it's us building the relationship and building the rapport, right? Because it creates the connection that there are other needs, or at least you're identifying and acknowledging those needs. Next slide, please. Some examples for sight, having some calm, non-exploitative photos. Actually, as an art, some of the art that we have is a lot of abstract art. And that can be extremely helpful because sometimes when clients have experienced some trauma responses or dissociation, sometimes we can use that art, right? And the pictures that you might have, if they're pictures like soothing pictures, maybe of nature as well, can be something very neutral. Smell, having lavender oil in a diffuser, hearing, the noise machine, white noise. Something I'm currently using is Spotify playlist. They have all kinds of soothing sounds, including instrumental music, bird sounds, nature sounds that you can have playing in the background. in your office. And also for taste, tea and snacks, candy, water, and for touch, you can have a Slinky. I also like to share about Play-Doh. Play-Doh has great feedback from clients. For all ages, by the way, it's not for just children. Even adults really appreciate having something that is tactile, that they can continue to play with during the meeting. And next slide. So for the case example, I wanted to share just a little bit of background on a recent legal team meeting I attended who involved a client who we have been working for some time. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when you have a long-term relationship with a client, there's a level of rapport and confidence in the relationship that there are things that you might be able to do in that client work compared to somebody that you just meeting. Okay, so please, I want to validate that sometimes hesitation or nervousness that might come up when we're first meeting a client. But with this particular case example, is somebody that we have been working for about 2 years. They have an extensive history of abuse, including familial abuse, and also experience labor trafficking. And so it's definitely somebody who has experienced complex trauma, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think what I really wanted to highlight in this case example is the relationship of Sonar and myself, specifically because I'm the assigned therapist in this case, the level of trust and communication with the legal partner. And the collaboration piece of it is so helpful because the client, if we think about modeling and mirroring and compassionate listening, the client notices the partnership and the collaboration. And I understand there's sometimes a lot of barriers to be able to build these important relationships between partners, but I want to still encourage it as much as possible, especially if you see and you're witnessing that the client needs further resources. Having a strong relationship with your partners, whether it's a mental health provider, case management provider, is extremely helpful for you as the legal provider and then also for the client. So going back to the case example, we also have a very clear understanding, right, of the roles the legal partner, the attorney, has in the client, in my role, in this case, in this meeting, as the therapist and emotional support provider. I like to include the emotional support provider because I'm not doing therapy in that legal meeting. I am there to support the client. Also, I want to highlight that this is something that the client requested as well for me to be present. So it's not something that I invited myself. This was an invitation from the client, a request from the client, and the attorney actually agreed with the request, right? I know there might be instances where it might not be appropriate, which is understandable, especially when we're thinking about criminal cases, right? In this case, it was an immigration relief application that was being completed, and the client had to review the declaration. Another thing to highlight with this case example, the client doesn't have any social or familial supports here in the US. And is very, very eager to have some form of immigration relief, right? Without immigration relief, people have little to none access, I should have said that the other way around, to basic needs, okay? The ability to work, to the ability to pay rent, or even obtain food. So he wanted to push through, but we could see the client struggling. We offer breaks. And it came to a point where the legal partner, the attorney, and I, we were able, because we have such a strong relationship, to have eye contact and be like, we need to take a break, right? And we created the break, and we all stood up, we stretched, we got water, went to the bathroom. Everybody decided to do something a little bit different, right? Because even for us as the provider, or even for you as the attorney, it can be a lot of stress to hold and witness somebody slowly become overwhelmed, right? So we also want to pick that up as well and go back to the point of like self-reflection and understanding where we are in this process of assisting clients. I want to be mindful of time. And also like by the client noticing the attorney and I in our communication, the client was able to model it and notice that, you know what, this was not what I needed at this time. I couldn't push through. Right. So they were able to identify themselves too, that at that time, it was not a moment that they could actually just get it all done. So we need to find that balance. It's a little bit of a dance where the client takes the lead, but then also as the attorney and as in this case, the clinician/therapist, we also need to assess, okay, is this really too much or not? Okay, and that's absolutely okay because we go back to sharing the why we're stopping and why we're taking a break. Great, I want to be mindful of time. Thank you, everyone. This was great to speak about, great opportunity again to share on my end with you all.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists from today. We are going to jump right into Q&A. There are a couple of questions that are already in the Q&A box. If you currently have any questions, please drop them in there now. I just want to be a little mindful of time. We've got about 9 minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the first question. And I think that two of the questions in here are pretty similar. So it looks like we have 3 questions right now. The first question is, can you expand on how not to over empathize? And I think that I'll go ahead and turn this over to Jessica to answer. And Christine, Erica, if you have anything additional, please feel free to chime in once Jessica's done.
Sure. So how not to, I think I want to take it back to that self-reflection piece. When we start feeling that we might be doing too much, I think it's a good sign for us to like, okay, let me step back. I validated, right? I validated maybe a second time. And maybe you can feel free to like move forward depending on what's going on with the meeting or the client and depending on the situation. And I another thing too is I try to refrain from saying I understand a lot, or I know exactly how you feel, right? So just picking and creating your own statements with the language that you use on regards to validation that seems and is genuine for you and then also for the client.
I think I would add to this a little bit because as an attorney, I think sometimes like there is a fine balance of what our roles is. And of course, after I said like, oh, we have these pedestals and these egos, you know, like we should be careful. I think the other thing though is understanding that the impact it can have on your client if you're so over empathetic that it doesn't look like you're also going to be the person that fights for them, right? Our role as an attorney is their advocate to speak on their behalf. So, you know, it can be, and I've heard from survivors too, that it's a really difficult thing to manage when your attorney is crying with you or like being too sympathetic, right? Like there is a little bit of like you serve a certain role that you're playing for them and you're not their therapist. So your role is slightly different.
If I could also add on just a little bit to that, for me, that indicates that when you're over empathizing, like you're clocking what's happening, you know, you're clocking the trauma that's coming through or the emotion that's coming through, and you as the recipient are having trouble processing what's coming at you. So then a lot of this over empathizing, and I'm speaking from personal experience, sometimes the over emphasizing or over like just sympatheticness, which can be how it is received, it's like your own thought process coming to light out of your mouth. You're trying to respond but you're caught up in the emotion, the trauma, the story that's coming through. And that's really where I believe, Erica, you mentioned that the clients are starting to feel like, oh, I need to start taking care of my attorney because all this this is becoming an emotional response on their end. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the next question. Panelists, we do have about 5 minutes left. So if possible, trying to just keep answers a little bit shorter so that we don't run out of time for everybody. Okay, so this next question says from Joanna Gardner, and I'm kind of looping in the other question on this same topic on how to end client interactions. Joanna asks, I often struggle with ending an interview. After the client has finished unpacking the suitcase, I feel ill-equipped to help them pack up again before they leave my office. I know I'm not a therapist, but are there tips for lawyers on how to conclude interviews in a way that doesn't leave the client feeling upset and unpacked, particularly where the organization doesn't have on-site therapy or social work services, so I can't send my clients next door to their therapist after they meet with me. So I'm going to turn that over to Christy.
Awesome. Okay, so this is definitely a question that I can understand and relate to. The answer, the short version is that the tip is going to be to not necessarily focus too much on the conclusion of the interview. And so the suggestion would be to really front end the interview, the dialogue, the interaction, and periodically disperse it through. So when somebody is starting to unpack, it's not all at once. Like it's possible that, I mean, it might become like a waterfall of information, sure, but there are often times where it's piece by piece. And so when you are asking a question and it just kind of starts to become more of this unpacking, then it's about being able to clock, and this is going to be difficult because basically it's a trauma responsiveness pop quiz. You are real time in real life responding and trying to navigate. I'm hearing you talk about a lot of difficult concepts. I can see that this is a really stressful question for you. I'm concerned that, after this interview is over, I don't want to, I'm pulling this out of nothing here. My lack of experience is showing. I would definitely defer to Jessica's list of do's and don'ts. But it would really be around how do you help guide the response? I'm hearing this, you normalize it, you clock it, and then you recenter and orient around the original question. So that happens during the conversation, not only at the end. If you do feel like there's been a lot of trauma that's come out that you feel like you haven't acknowledged it, I would really emphasize the role aspect of your boundaries, because you're not a therapist. It's also not necessarily going to be in your role set to help the client leave your happy and put together. Might not actually be a viable outcome in certain cases, and that's okay. It's doing your best and offering, do you have someone to talk to about some of this stuff? This seemed like it was really difficult for you to talk about.
Thank you so much, Christy. And Jessica, did you have anything else to add on to that, since we had that list of kind of do's and try instead?
No, I think Christy did great.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. Can you talk a little more about how to balance asking open-ended questions with the need to get specific information within a time frame that's respectful of our clients / our own time? So I'm going to turn that over to Erica.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this is one of those questions that has to do with a lot of prep work and knowing and understanding, for example, in trafficking, what trafficking is and what are the points that you need to get on. Then once you have been able to narrow your framework of your questions, and Cass has a sample, T visa interview form that's pretty applicable across other forms of legal relief. But a lot of this is prep work. What are the questions I need to know so I can redirect? And then what are the questions that I need to follow up on? And then when there's things that are struggling with a time frame, then we can lean on our social service provider allies who do have tips on framing and putting things in a time frame? Like, is it drawing stuff out and writing, or asking about certain markers in their life that would help put them in the context? Is it before or after your child was born, et cetera, like et cetera, et cetera. But really, for me, this is a question really rooted in, do I understand what severe form of trafficking in persons is? Do I understand what sexual assault is, so that I can narrow my questions to very specific things? And before I even get into any of the questions, prepping my client with the types of things that I'm going to ask and the types of things we need to focus on for the purposes of, the form of legal relief.
Thank you so much. And also, to answer this question, if you refer back to Jessica's portion in the very beginning on that do and don't and try this instead list, there is one example for how to get through certain questions, especially sensitive questions, within a specific time frame while working in tandem with the individual's need for breaks and things like that. So it is 2:30, and so I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. There is one question. Oh, nope. Looks like Kate and Chrissy answered those questions in a chat. If folks are interested in any additional questions, you can feel free to reach out to both CAST and to Sanad for follow-up technical assistance, but I will let Erica talk a little bit about that before we close out.
Hi, folks. So we are TA partners, technical assistance partners with Project Trust, and we're here to answer any questions that you have. We do on this is not the CAST website, so I did want to clarify that this is our Nation Builder site that has all of our TTA resources available, including where you can ask for individual help. But when I talk about these technical assistance calls, we have a weekly call for attorneys to troubleshoot any trafficking cases that they're working on. And every third Wednesday of the month, we also have Christy to join us to answer questions about trauma-informed issues, or even navigating how we work with social service providers. And every fourth Thursday of the month, we have a multidisciplinary call for social service providers to kind of talk about this stuff. So you are all always invited.
Thank you so much, Erica. And lastly, I'm just going to go ahead and plug the information for Sanad, for both myself and for Jessica. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us at those emails. And lastly, if you are interested in getting any technical training or technical assistance support from Project Trust, you can submit a request at Project Trust website or via our email at projecttrust@uscrimail.org. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to hosting you all again for our next webinar. Have a great rest of your day.